Well, welcome to another Friday night. I want to do something a little bit differently tonight and over the next couple of weeks. I want to take you on a journey of walking through some case studies with me so that you kind of see the progression of how counseling works with somebody with trauma, some of the issues that come up, and hopefully it'll help you maybe identify some of your own issues. And what I want to focus on tonight is a woman named Sara. And I want you to see kind of the first months of her counseling and defensiveness and denial that were a big part of how she dealt with life. And most of us have dealt with people who you make a comment to them that's you think positive or encouraging, or you ask them a question that you just think is a general interest type of question, and all of a sudden they're very defensive, they're lashing out at you, they're trying to take a shot at you. It's almost like you're trying to hurt them or be the enemy or attack them, and you're not, but that's how they perceive it, and they are very defensive. And then they deny that that's an issue for them at all. And you're going, whoa, something's off here. It must be an issue because of their extreme response. And that's a very common response for people from more severe complex trauma. And so I want to just look at that because it's something that if you're in therapy that you're probably going to have to deal with in your own life. And if you're a therapist, it's something that you just have to begin to learn tools to help get past that in people's lives. So the case studies of Sara is not an actual Sara. It's not the details of her story. It's a conglomeration of many clients over the years that I've worked with, and I'm also going to be kind of taking the main storyline from Catherine Gildener in her book Good Morning Monster, where she just crafted a really nice story, and it's just a conglomeration of her clients as well. And so that is, you're not going to be able to connect to any specific person is what I want you to see. But what I want you to see as we really focus on this is that defensiveness is often something you can see in others before you can see in yourself. And so I'm hoping that by telling this story and you see the defensiveness in Sara, that it might help you see any defensiveness that you have in yourself. But I also want you to see that a big part of complex trauma is denial and defensiveness. It's a necessary tool for a child to be able to cope. Because often what's happening to the child is too painful for the brain to accept, to absorb, to process. They have no way of resolving it. They have nobody to support them. And so the pain is just too overwhelming to try to handle on their own. And so their brain's only defense, if they're going to survive, is to deny, to dissociate, and then to become quite defensive or resistant to anybody that would try to get them to face the truth about their situation. They just can't go there. So what begins to happen over the years as they have this truth inside of them that is just too painful is that anybody that tries to bring them up is a threat, because they perceive that that person's trying to hurt them, expose them. That person is trying to bring up all this pain or say they're bad, judge them, whatever. And so they go immediately into that defensiveness posture. But with that, in order to be able to sustain that over time, they have to begin to do a couple other things in their brain, which are quite fascinating. And these happen at a subconscious level. But the first thing that they do is their brain begins to build all kinds of rationale or justifications as to why denial is the right response and why their distorted logic is actually good logic. So they build case after case as to why it's a good thing that they're not looking at that topic. But then they even go beyond that and they make it in their mind like it's righteous, that they're in a righteous position, a superior position to others, they're stronger than others for taking that denial position. And then They look down on anybody who wants to get to the truth. They somehow make that person morally inferior, weak, that there's not healthy, they're just a weakling, but they will find a way to look down on people that want to look at stuff honestly. And then the fourth thing that they do is if somebody brings up something that touches on the area that they're denying, they will immediately go into denial. But it's like the person tried to put a seed onto concrete. It doesn't even penetrate. They don't give it a second thought later. They don't go back and go, I wonder if that person was right. It's just blocked from their mind. They don't even go back to consider it again. That's how secure the defenses of denial become for this person. So when you get a person like this in counseling, you've got a challenge. And part of what you're doing is trying to get past all those defenses so that they'll finally get honest, because it's only when they finally get honest that they can heal and grow. So Sara, she was a beautiful young woman in her 30s who came into the psychologist. And the only reason she came into the psychologist is she said she went to her doctor. Doctor told her she had herpes. The doctor put her on strong medication to deal with the herpes symptoms, but the strong medication wasn't working. The herpes continued to flare up. So the doctor said to her, herpes is often exacerbated by stress. And so you may have some stress stuff going on that keeps causing this herpes to be activated. So I would suggest you go to a psychologist and get some help for your stress. Get some tools that will help you reduce your stress. So Sara immediately goes on with the psychologist to make it clear that she has zero desire for therapy. She doesn't even want to be here. She's only here because she wants help with her herpes. So the therapist, trying to build a bit of a rapport, asks Sara about her stress. So Sara says, I know what the word stress means, but I don't know what it feels like. I don't think I have it then. I just keep on keeping on. I'm surrounded by a village of idiots, but I just plod away. And she goes on to say that nothing really has ever bothered her much in her life, so she doesn't think she's ever had much stress. But she does acknowledge that this whole herpes thing has really shaken her like nothing else has in her life. So couple of things that stand out to me is that immediately there's some resistance you sense in Sara, that she sees therapy as a sign of weakness, that it's an admission of failure, so she doesn't want therapy. You see also that she really doesn't have much self-awareness. She doesn't know what stress is. She doesn't think she has much stress, but I can probably already guess there's tons of stress that's been all through her life, but she's totally unaware of that. And so it's important to realize that the greater the denial, the less self-awareness that the person will have, because they've been denying so many things that they are not even aware of them in their own life. The problem is that they often think they have great self-awareness. That's partly how they compensate for that. And so if you were to say they don't have great self-awareness, or they don't have good self-awareness at all, they'd really argue with you because they think they do. So the therapist, again, trying to build rapport, says to Sara, what's been the worst part of having herpes for you? So Sara starts by saying that it's the shame of having to tell potential partners that she wants to sleep with that she's has herpes or is a carrier of herpes, and just the shame of that. But then she adds something else. She said that she's done everything possible to rise above her family circumstances. She was now wallowing in filth just like they always did. It's like quicksand, she said. No matter how hard I try to crawl out of the ooze and slime, I keep getting sucked back in. So she's making an allusion to her family being really messed up, being not in a good place. So therapist goes, oh, okay, tell me about your family. And Sara just says, nope, not going into all that bilge. So basically, it's like the bilge on a boat, sewer, dirty water. I'm not even going to talk about it. So huge denial, huge resistance to go there. But then Sara quickly covers by saying she's a very practical person. She's not here to talk about her past. All she wants to do is decrease her stress, whatever that was. So again, she's minimizing this whole concept, resistant to it. So the only reason she wants to get this stress dealt with is so she could deal with her herpes and get that under control. And then she says she plans to only attend this one session where the therapist is either going to give her a pill or cure her of her stress. So in her mind, she thinks this can be taken care of in one session. So the therapist goes on to explain that most people need several appointments to learn how to manage stress, because stress can be a very deep-seated problem that's connected to a whole lot of underlying issues that people aren't even aware of, and it takes time to uncover the source of the stress and to learn tools to manage it. The therapist also says, just to, again, kind of build rapport, is that stress and increased stress affects the immune system. So the body is putting all its energy into handling stress, so it has nothing left in the immune system to handle viruses like herpes. That's why they flare up. Sara says, I can't believe I have to do this. That means go to more than one session. I feel like I came in to get a tooth pulled by the dentist and he wants to take out my whole brain. Sara looked disgusted, and she finally capitulated and said, okay, I'll book one more appointment. So she's very resistant, but she's going to do one more and give it one more chance. So a couple of things for you just to be aware of. Sara thinks that her problems is herpes. She can't see that it's connected to anything else in her life. She struggles even to see how stress might be related to it. She thinks she can just learn a few quick tools that will deal with stress. She can learn them in an instant, and then that'll solve all her problems. So she's got this very clear picture in her mind of what this is going to look like, but it's totally wrong. So we see lots of denial and defensiveness already when it comes to looking at her family, looking at her past. She just does not want to go there. And as soon as the therapist tries to go there, Sara starts making shots at her. So Sara goes from the first session, comes back to the next session, and even though she's super resistant, she comes back carrying 4 books on stress, and they're just full of yellow Post-it notes that she's added to all the different pages. And then she's lugging a huge flip chart. So she's done her homework. And she's on the flip chart, she's drawn this elaborate color-coded graph. Across the top, she's written stress, question mark, question mark, question mark. And then below, there are several columns. And the first is colored red, and it's titled Dealing with Assholes. A number of assholes are listed in subcategories. So one was her boss, Daryl, another was her boyfriend, Derek, and the third was her father. So she gets all this on display in the therapist's room. So again, Sara was very resistant, but at least she was willing to do the work. Now I want you to see what enabled her to do this work. In her mind, the cause of her stress was assholes, other people who she saw as just pain in the ass. So she's got all kinds of energy now and enthusiasm about finding out why they're such terrible people, to look at them, to focus on their problems, to focus on why they're so screwed up. That keeps the focus off of her, and so she's willing to do that. She likes to tear other people down. And so as a therapist, you're going, okay, it's not ideal. We want to eventually get her to look at herself, but this is where she's willing to start. So we're going to meet her there and start there and see where it goes. So Sara has been reading these books on stress, trying to kind of sort out what's the cause of it in her life. And she's worked on this chart all week. And the therapist says to her, I notice there's no women on your chart. There's just 3 men. Interesting, Sara says. Yeah, that's true. I don't know any asshole woman. I guess if I met any, I just avoid them or I not let them get under my skin. So the therapist goes, okay, what qualifies these men to be on your list? And Sara says, well, they're people who don't follow any rules and who really don't give a shit about making things work. So again, she's got a basic definition of people who cause you stress. So the therapist says, okay, I see that your father's on your list. I'd really like to kind of explore that and just have you construct a history of your life to date with your father. So when Sara hears this, she just rolls her eyes big time, obvious for the therapist to see, like not wanting to go there, huge resistance. So the therapist, again, trying to build some rapport, says, well, give me one vivid memory of your father. So Sara immediately says it was when she'd fallen off a slide when she was 4 and she slid her foot on a sharp piece of metal. Her father tenderly picked her up and carried her to the hospital for stitches. When they were in the waiting room, the nurse remarked on the terrible gash and how she was being a real trooper and not whining. Her father put his arm around Sara and hugged her and said, that's my girl. I'm proud of her. She's never complains and is as strong as a horse. Now, I want you to see that for a young girl, and we're going to see she hardly ever got validation, this was a powerful message. This was powerful validation. But what it said is that Sara's greatest value was that she didn't complain. She sucked it up. She was strong. She was hard. She was tough. And that was given to her in a validation that felt so much like love, so much like affection. It had a powerful impact in shaping Sara and how she thought about herself and what she thought made a person healthy. But there's something I want you to see. The recollection Sara has of her father is a very positive one, and she's going to continue to have positive recollections mixed with some very negative recollections. Her dad's on her asshole list, but her dad's her hero. That's what we're going to see. And so it's always interesting to me as a therapist that that's a common thing when there's denial. There's an internal contradiction in the thinking of the person about the person who caused them their greatest pain. They're their hero often, but they're an asshole in their mind often. So the therapist goes on to ask Sara about her mother. And Sara says that her mother died when she was 8. She really doesn't have any memories of her mother, and she doesn't even know how her mother died. So the therapist kind of starts to say, well, give me some help in understanding what your mother was like. And she goes, well, only 2 words, remote and Italian. She couldn't retrieve a single memory of her mother. Again, that's significant, but the therapist kind of probes a little bit, and Sara finally comes up with one memory. And it's when she was 4, her mother gave her a toy stove for Christmas. Sara remembers her mother smiling as she opened it. And then she says, do you have any memories around your mother dying? And she says, well, she was fine that morning. My younger brother and sister and I came home from school at lunchtime and there was no lunch, which was very strange. So she opened the door to her parents' bedroom and her mother looked like she was sleeping. She shook her, rolled her over, and her mother was dead. And Sara says, I can still visualize the marks on her face from the chenille bedspread. I didn't call my dad because I didn't know where he worked. I told my brother and sister to go back to school. Then I called 911. She then goes on to give a bit of what she was told about her mother. And her mother was the only girl in a family of 5 boys. She wasn't allowed, it was an Italian household, she wasn't allowed to go out of the house once she hit the age of 10. That's how protective they were of her. She had to stay home and cook and clean. She could go shopping with her mother, but could never go out alone. One of the brothers had to walk her to and from school every day. So, despite the strictness of her upbringing, Sarah's mother somehow managed to get pregnant at 16. Sarah's father was a Canadian of Scottish descent, and according to the mother's Italian family, the father was a young hoodlum because he had impregnated her. When the father turned 17, the brothers beat him to a pulp, said that they would kill him if he didn't marry their sister, which he did. After the wedding day, not one of the family ever saw her again. They basically disowned her. Sarah's mother was kicked out and gone. So Sara was born 5 months after the wedding. Then her sister was born 20 months later, and her brother arrived 1 year after that. So 3 children back to back to these teenagers. So mother is found dead. You have to wonder, as a therapist, did the mother commit suicide? It was never pursued. It's possible. It would seem it was very likely that she could have been clinically distressed after the upbringing she had, being traumatized, overprotective, dominated by violent males, forced to marry a man who didn't want to marry her, who was inadequate, possibly emotionally and physically abusive, who resented and ignored her, parents who disowned her, never forgave her for shaming them. She had nowhere else to turn. She had nobody in her life to support her. So that's also in Sarah's past. Well, the year after Sarah's mother died, her father moved out of the city to a little village a couple hours north of Toronto in cottage country, wilderness country. Sara thought that he was avoiding men in Toronto who were pursuing him. She didn't know why, but that's what she thought. To make money, he opened a chip truck that served cottage customers that were there in the summer. The sister and the brother, they spent their day playing in the parking lot, while Sara worked alongside her dad, opening cans of pop for customers, serving the fries to the customers, and her father called Sara his right-hand man. So there's another validation that she got. They lived in a small cottage outside of town that was owned by a family who had a number of very modest cabins scattered in very isolated spots throughout the woods on their property. The 3 siblings began school in September when Sara was 9, but then the chip business quickly began to dry up because we're coming into winter. All the cottagers left. And so her dad bought a small space heater for a 1-room cottage, and they just huddled around it to stay warm. And then Sara recalled that one day 2 men appeared at the door demanding money from their father for the chip truck. Her father hid in the bathroom, refused to go to the door, made Sara go to the door and talk to these men and get rid of them at 9 years old. And then in November, so a little while later, one day her father said he was driving into town to get some cigarettes. He drove into town and never came back. So Sara was left with her 2 younger siblings who had no food, and they only had 2 sets of clothes. So that was Sara's experience. Now, as Sara described this, she relayed the story with no anger, no emotions. It was just blank. She was just reciting details. She went on to say that she didn't tell anybody that they had been abandoned by her dad because she was afraid that they would then get placed in foster care. So she decided she had to be the mom. She had to keep the kids in the routines as if dad was there. So the cabins, which were deep in the forest in this lake country, were owned by this couple who had been very, very nice to Sara and her two siblings. And so her two younger siblings, they really wanted to go and tell this family that they had been abandoned, hoping that they would take care of them. But Sara was very afraid that they would go and report it to the police and they get put in foster care. And so she said, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to tell anybody, not even the owners of the cabin. We are going to make this work, just the three of us. So all of this responsibility on her shoulders at 9 to keep her siblings alive in the Canadian winter in the wilderness. When the therapist asked Sara how she felt about being abandoned by her dad, Sara looked at her with disgust, as if she is being melodramatic. She said, we weren't really abandoned. My dad knew I was there to deal with things. But you were 9 years old. You were penniless. You were alone in a forest. What would you call it? Well, I guess technically it was abandonment, but my dad had to get out of town. He didn't want to leave us, but he didn't have a choice. So you notice there's resistance to look honestly at what her father had done, abandoned 3 little children. Sara has developed a rationale, a justification in her brain that kind of made excuses for her dad, and that somehow enabled her to avoid the pain. So my dad didn't have a choice. He didn't want to. She's just making excuses. But then, because the counselor is asking with empathy, she's trying to make it, you're being melodramatic. She's scoffing at anybody that would see this as unhealthy, as unnatural. So she's got these defenses in her brain that she's just not willing to look at this honestly. So Sara talks about not remembering having any feelings at the time. All she had was she had to get into action with plans to survive. So her survival instinct took over because she had 2 little children to clothe and feed in the wilderness in the winter. Sara would often deride the therapist's constant inquiring about, well, how did that make you feel? And she indicated that feelings were luxuries for people who live cushy lives and don't have to, as you put it, use their wits. So again, she's taking people who are actually being healthy and having emotions and making them look inferior. They have cushy lives. They don't have to use their wits. So again, another defense in her brain. So Sara said she kept a very clear head after her dad left. She realized that most of the cabins had already been cleared out for the winter, so she and her siblings moved to the most remote cabin that was not likely to be discovered or opened by anybody until the spring. So it was their best chance of staying safe. They took the little heater with them, and then she knew she had to maintain the same routines they had when they lived with their dad. And so they would walk for nearly a mile to get to the bus stop every day so they could go to school and look normal. And then they would come home, walk a mile back to the cabin, not say anything to anybody about her dad, about what was going on, and she grilled into her siblings. They had to keep this a secret. So the therapist says, so you were left alone in a cabin at the ages of 9, 7, and 6. If you're looking for stressful events, that could go on the list. And here's Sara's response. First of all, it's over. Second, I'm still standing. Third, 9 isn't really that young. Well, how long did this go on? 6 or 7 months. So the therapist at the end of the session sums it up. Says, you have been brave. Your life sounds like it's been difficult and at times frightening. You were abandoned, alone, in the woods, and responsible for 2 younger children whom you were too young to parent. Sara sat there for a full minute before replying. And it would be almost 5 years of therapy that was spent with Sara, and this was one of the few times in which her eyes filled with tears. But they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of anger. And she said, "Why are you saying that stuff?" When the therapist said that she was empathizing with her, she rebuffed the therapist and said, "That's what you say to people when someone dies. Listen, doctor, if I'm ever to come back here, I never want you to do that again, or I'll walk out. Keep your empathy or whatever it is to yourself." "Why?" the therapist asked, genuinely puzzled. "When you say things about feelings, I see a door opening that's full of hobgoblins, and I am never going to enter that room. I have to keep going. If I ever start to wallow, even once, I'll drown. Plus, it doesn't make things any better. Before I leave today, you have to promise you will never do that again. Otherwise, I can't come back." So the therapist says, "So what you're saying is that you never want any kindness, empathy, or sympathy from me." "Right. If I want sympathy, I'll get a Hallmark card in a dose I can handle." So notice again, Sara gets so defensive. And it's because her validation as a child came from her father for being strong, for not showing any weakness. That had served her well when she parented her two siblings in the wilderness. But her brain, in doing all the years of doing that, had now twisted empathy as a weakness, and that it was actually wallowing in self-pity. It was useless. It was negative. It was what weak people did. She had to be constantly hard. That was the rule of her life. She had to be strong. Emotions were not allowed to rule her life. So again, you can see, wow, there's huge resistance here to going to emotions. There's huge resistance to experiencing anybody else's compassionate emotions. But what you also see is that Sara is afraid of emotions. She's afraid that if she goes and opens that door, it's going to consume her. It's going to be too much for her. So she's afraid. So that's part of why she's so resistant to this being poked at. Okay, the therapist said, let's go back to the cabin where you, as a 9-year-old, are living with your 8-year-old sister, 6-year-old brother. So Sara says, okay, this is like the freezing cold water at the lake. It's best just to dive in and swim. So don't interrupt me. Just let me spill it out. When you hear this, you're going to think, no wonder she has herpes. She deserves it. Now notice again, and this is common, Sara is kind of prefacing what she's going to say by anticipating that others are going to judge her. Others are going to look down on her. But it indicates that she already is judging herself. She has tons of shame. She has a self-loathing. And so she reads that now into everybody else's response. And that's partly why she gets defensive, is because she expects and reads into people's response that they're judging her, that they're hating her. So Sara looked out the window, avoided eye contact, and began her tale in a very monotone voice. She said, "A few days after my father left, I realized we had to eat. Plus, Craig's, and that's her younger brother's, teacher came to my class and asked why Craig had no lunch. She described how Craig had begun crying in class and the other students donated lunch. Teacher noticed that Craig put crackers in his pocket. She asked me if things were all right at home. I said, yep, everything's fine. My dad was just getting his paycheck that day, and so he wasn't able to make lunch. So the teacher wanted to call her home, but I told her we didn't have a phone. So she's making excuses. She's now lying. She's concocting stories, all to avoid going to the truth. The teacher asked her to have her mother call the school. She doesn't even know their mother's dead. That's when I stole money from the milk collection box, Sara went on. It was passed around and everyone was supposed to put their lunch money in, but I actually just took lunch money out. Not a lot, or I would have been caught. Then after school, I gave my sister Tracy the money to go and buy some penny candy at the grocery store. And while she was doing that and distracting the clerk, I stole canned hams and all kinds of food. I was really good at it. I went all over town to different stores so that no one would suspect me. So they developed their little routine where younger sister takes the stolen lunch money, buys some candy, that distracts the clerk. Sara steals the necessities for supper and breakfast, etc. Then Sara described how she managed to keep her siblings in clean clothes without having a washing machine. She said our favorite program was The Wonderful World of Disney. So on Disney night, I would make everyone have a bath and I'd throw out their old clothes. I went to the Giant Tiger store every Friday before the weekend and stole new outfits for Monday. I was an incredible thief, just like my father. Maybe it's genetic. Tracy cried what felt like all the time, so that's the other younger sister. Craig never said a word other than that he was hungry. He wet the bed. At first I yelled at him, but then I just ignored it and let him sleep in it. Finally, I did things like say I was going to leave them if they didn't stop complaining or didn't do what I said. It worked. I was now the mum. But Sara looked at the floor. Her shame was palpable. She didn't usually look pained, but one could tell that she was about to say something that profoundly affected her. She said, I wasn't a good mum. I wouldn't allow anyone to talk about Dad or his leaving. So she wouldn't let her siblings process their pain. If they started to get blubbery, I said we had to keep going, and I would hit anyone who whimpered. Sara then asked the therapist if she thought she was evil or crazy. So again, she's expecting judgment. She's judging herself. So the therapist sees this as a time to reframe everything in a more accurate picture. And she says, I would say that you're far from crazy. In fact, I would say that you're resourceful. You did what you had to do to stay afloat. You wanted to keep your family together. And you did more than most 9-year-olds could ever have done. I think you were heroic. Sara's response was, stop Mr. Rogering me. So again, she can't accept a positive perspective, any validation. And that is so common for children who grew up not getting it and now distrust positive things that adults might say to them. Then Sara goes on to say, I can still feel the terror of stealing those canned hams. I can still smell the wet cardboard the owner of the store had put on the floor to soak up all the slush in the winter. The therapist says, but you did it for the survival of yourself, your sister, and your brother. Yes, but I was mean to them, though. Yes, but you were realistic. You couldn't have too much crying and whining, or you would have gone under. You would have lost your siblings. You would have gone into childcare. You ran a tight ship. But look how kind you became to Craig in his bedwetting after you learned on TV some better tools to help children with bedwetting. But Sara wasn't having any of this, trying to reframe it. She needed that old way of looking at it. And she said, I wasn't really a good mother. And here's my proof. Tracy and Craig today are now screwed up as adults. Tracy never finished high school. She lives in some god-awful place in the country and works pulling turkeys apart in a factory. She's hooked up with a handyman named Andrew. Both of them are pretty basic. They have no idea how to have a relationship or even get along. My brother Craig has a kid already. He doesn't live with the mother, and he's a deadbeat father. He works seasonally plowing snow and basically smokes a lot of pot. Are you aware that you were 9 years old when you were expected to become a parent? So what? A lot of girls have to parent at 9. They manage. So notice the profound shame that Sara felt is based on the delusion that she should have had the tools and knowledge to be a good parent at 9. It's so important to realize that often people's worst pain is due to their belief of a false premise, that they should have been something that it was impossible for them to be. So the therapist says, you couldn't have been a good mom without help. You were forced to do a job that you couldn't possibly have known how to do. Failure was built into the plan of you being a mother at 9. Sara never fully resolved the false guilt she felt at failing her younger brother and sister and not being the mom she should have been to them, or she thought she should have them, but was impossible for her to be. She continued to beat herself up and couldn't accept that she'd just been a little girl who wasn't equipped for the job. In the next session, Sara described how their frightening fairy tale existence in the cabin ended after the winter. She said, I screwed up. I got caught stealing underpants for Craig at Giant Tiger. When the police picked us up, they took us back to the cabin. They were shocked. They just shook their heads. They knocked on the door of the people who owned the cabins and asked if they would keep us until Children's Aid could be contacted or until they could find our father and make arrangements. It would take 4 years before their father resurfaced. Ron and Glenda had 3 children of their own. Sara could tell that Tracy and Craig were really happy living with this new family, but it really upset her. I thought we were doing all right on our own. Plus, I wasn't being used to being told what to do. Of the 3 of us, I was the only one who was struggling with adjusting to living with this family, where they ended up staying for 4 years. So the therapist asked, what were they like? Nice, I guess, was Sara's answer. They had discipline and order. Tracy and Craig still think of them as their parents and visit them on Christmas. I don't. Glenda, the mother, had a lot of rules, and she wanted things done her way, and I wasn't going for it. Why do you think your brother and sister adjusted better than you did? Sara said that, well, she had always been her father's favorite. Dad had never been mean to her, but he ignored Tracy and was mean to Craig, so maybe that's why Tracy and Craig just liked these new kind people. Her father had always called Craig Mummy's boy because he was so slight and fragile. But this new man, he treated Craig very nicely. He took him fishing. He was always kind to him. And all of a sudden, Craig's stutter, which he had always had, began to clear up. So Craig's trouble stopped when we were there, and I would admit it was a relief to have food on the table. Tracy and Craig think Glenda, the mother, walks on water. She was so devoted to them. She took so much care of Tracy, who was so full of insecurities. But I didn't like Glenda. She was always fussing over me, telling me that I needed to do this. And if I was going to go out in the winter without a hat, she'd say I needed to wear a hat. And I couldn't figure out, why are you doing all of this? And she says, I guess I never knew what it was like to be mothered. So I want to stop here for today. This is how far the therapist got with Sara in 1 year. So what I want you to begin to realize is she's made some progress. Sara has opened up about a lot of things, has started to explore her past, but there is still huge resistance in 2 main areas. She refuses to talk about emotions. She's just not going to go there unless it's anger, self-hatred. Secondly, she refuses to talk about her dad. She just can't begin to look honestly at him. And so for a person with this kind of trauma, and you can see there's a ton of trauma here, you can see the necessity of denial in Sara's life, and therefore that she's totally unaware of how much stress she's lived with, how much stress was her normal, how stress totally messed up her central nervous system and her immune system. She's totally unaware of that, but denies that it's a problem. And she's resistant to going and looking at the very things that are causing all her problems. She has got defense after defense in place to never go there. When you get a client like that, it's going to take a long time. So it ends up taking 5 years before Sara is finally able to look totally honestly at these deep, painful issues that she's avoided all her life, thinking that the only way to survive was avoid emotions, avoid looking honestly at her dad and the abandonment. But a patient therapist gradually helped her feel safe enough and supported enough to go there. So, if you've been listening today and you begin to realize, wow, I've got some areas where I'm defensive and I'm in denial, what do I need to do? So the first thing that I would say to you is, if you spot areas of defensiveness and denial, ask yourself why. And usually it's a fear. What am I afraid of? What am I afraid will happen if I go to that subject? So it can work out this way. It can be like Sara. If I open that can of worms, it is going to be so painful. And it's a can of worms I couldn't resolve as a kid, so I'm pretty sure I'm going to resolve it now. So all I'm going to do by opening that can of worms is to go to an overwhelming pain. What's the point? It's better just to stay away from unresolvable pain. You don't realize that now you have tools and supports that you could actually resolve that pain. Your brain still thinks like the child that that's unresolvable, so just don't go there. But the second thing is, for many people, so in their 30s, 40s, they start to do recovery and they go, if I start looking at all of the things I'm denying, what I'm going to realize is that I've built my life on lies. So she built her life on emotions are for weak people. Only strong people are healthy. People that are empathetic, they have cushy lives. They're weaklings. They don't have to deal with reality. She's got lie, distortion, one after the other that she's built her life on. Then she's had the lie that her dad was her hero. Her dad never did anything wrong. And she's not. If I start looking at those lies, I'm going to see that I've built my life on a faulty foundation. I've built my whole life on lies. And if I start dismantling my life, what do I have left? My whole security in life and feeling good about myself has been based on lies. If I take the lies away, I have nothing. Then I'm a total failure. Then I'm exposed as being a sham, as being a loser. I can't go there. And because I don't know what healthy looks like, I don't know how to rebuild my life. So by exposing the lies, all I'd be is dismantling my life and ending up with a pile of rubble and not have a clue how to do that. And after 40 years of hanging on to lies, I just don't know if I can dismantle all those lies. That's a deep fear for many people. But then there's another thing that some people have, and that is, okay, if I admit my dad was a loser, then what else am I going to have to admit about my dad? Then what other secrets am I going to have to expose? To get honest about one lie is just going to lead to another lie, and then another lie, and then another lie. And I'm going to have to get deeper and deeper and deeper into the truth and reveal secrets that I'm afraid to reveal because of what people are going to think of me and what I think of myself. And so it's scary to get honest. There's a ton of fear that you're going to have to confront. And so that's why I tell people, go slowly. Don't just dive into this all at once. Go very slowly and do it with somebody who is safe, but somebody who's capable in helping you process that, who supports you, who teaches you tools so that you can resolve it. So remember, often a child uses defensiveness because when they've tried to process and get honest, there's been nobody safe. They've been judged. They've been condemned. They've been punished. They've been told they're weak. So to get honest has always led to pain. And so they've had to be defensive. They've had to live in denial because there's been nobody to help them process the pain. So now it's important to remind yourself that you have safe people. You're not alone anymore. You're not going to be judged now. You have people who accept you, who love you, who will give you the tools to get through this. So next week we're going to look at Sara a little bit more, but I hope this just gives you some insight into your own life, but also into how slow the journey can be when one begins to heal from trauma. Well, that's the end of another Friday night. Thank you for being here.